Hello everyone and welcome to the first video here on my channel. Let's get right into it. So this video I'm going to rank the top 2 placings at each Mr. Olympia from 1990 until 2021. To achieve that, I'm gonna use the following criteria. Physique has to do with the quality of the physique of the two competitors, how muscular they were, how was their conditioning, and how they showcased their physique. Competitiveness means the difference in quality between the two competitors. I'm not necessarily going by the judges' scorecards, more so my perception. Rivalry, giving an example, Phil Eve and Kai Green, those rivalries always made the top 2 more exciting. They up the ante, so to speak. Predictability. So was the top 2 predictable, or was it exciting? Was it something different? Did someone improve a lot from last year? Historical significance means how was the show perceived in the context of bodybuilding at the time? Were there a new standard of physiques achieved? Or was it just a run of the mill Mr. Olympia? And this last criteria, show quality, basically I came up with this criteria to balance out some shows that had some unpredictability and some competitiveness, but didn't have necessarily the best physique. I felt that I needed an extra criteria basically to balance those shows out from other ones that, were a bit better, basically. It just goes to show, basically it means if maybe the decision of the winner, or overall the quality of the show itself, if it impacted in a negative way the top 2 and the show overall. So let's get to it. So the first show, obviously 1990, Lee Haney placing first, Lee Labrada placing second. So I ranked this show 11 points. So physique, I gave them 3 out of 5. This show, I think, it had a controversy due to drug testing. So obviously the competitors came a bit, downsized or in a different kind of lower than their average from prior years. Competitiveness, it wasn't a landslide for Lee Haney. I even believe Lee Labrada took one of the rounds. Rivalry wise, Lee Labrada was a top competitor for quite some time, so there was an element of rivalry, you could say. Predictability, it was still relatively predictable. It was the 7th title in a row, Mr. Olympia, for Lee Haney. For historical significance, I gave it a 2. It was, a meaningful Mr. Olympia, but not necessarily, one of the biggest ones. And show quality, I gave it a 1, which means it was basically a good show. Next up is Lee Haney versus Dorian Yates, 1991. I say versus, but, they competed in the same show. So I gave 5 as far as physique. Why did I give 5? I feel like this show was like the turning point of bodybuilding to a certain extent. Some people would say 93, but this was the first Mr. Olympia where Dorian showed up and he would up the standards of bodybuilding in the next few years. But this was a beginning, and some would say this was also Lee Haney's best physique. So I feel like you could quite tell the turning point of bodybuilding on this show, and compared to everyone else in that era in 1991, these were definitely the top 2 physiques. So I gave it a 5. Competitiveness, it was very competitive. The perceived idea was that Lee Haney edged out the show. He didn't necessarily crush Dorian. People thought that, in a few years with more improvement, Dorian would overtake Lee Haney as the Mr. Olympia. Predictability, no, sorry, rivalry-wise, uh, obviously Dorian wasn't necessarily that well known at this show. There was like his first or second pro year as a pro. Yet you can watch some videos where Dorian actually mentions having a certain attitude towards Lee Haney, mentally trying to not be overwhelmed by the legend that Lee Haney was. So there was a rivalry element already. Predictability, yes, Lee Haney won once again, yet, uh, you know, uh, Dorian was a newcomer to the Mr. Olympia, so it added unpredictability to the show. Historical significance, I already basically told about this criteria on the physique one. It was a very significant show, and show quality, I gave it a 1. It might seem low a 1, but basically 2 are reserved for like all-star lineups, which this one was pretty close to. Maybe I could give it a 2, but it's already pretty high on the other criteria. And 0 is mostly to give 0 to shows where there's either a big very bad decision or overall a bad lineup. 1992, Kevin Levrone on his first Mr. Olympia, runner up to Dorian Yates winning his first Mr. Olympia. So we never got to see the rematch between Lee Haney and Dorian Yates, but we got the newcomer Kevin Levrone challenging Dorian Yates. Now, physique-wise, I thought that both of them had great physiques. Dorian had improved, and Kevin Levrone, although he was the smallest probably of his pro career, he was also probably the most conditioned, or some of the most conditioning he ever brought to the stage. So that gets a 4. Competitiveness wise, I don't think it was that competitive. You could even argue that other people should have placed second instead of Levrone. Rivalry wise, again, Levrone was a newcomer to the Olympia stage, so there wasn't much either happening on stage as far as rivalry goes or a prior history. Predictability gets a 2 because of Levrone, jumping all of the other Olympia veterans. Historical significance, I think it's pretty significant of a show. The first ever win by Yates, the debut at the Olympia of Levrone, and it was a good show, so it gets 1 in quality, show quality. So Dorian Yates placing first for the second time, Flex Wheeler debuting in the Mr. Olympia and placing second. This show is very well known. Not only did the runner-up bring incredible shape, but also other contestants, as you can see, Sean Ray. But when it comes to the top 2, we definitely got 2 versions that most people consider the all-time best of these 2 bodybuilders. So coming down to the rating, I gave this show 16 points. Physique wise, I gave it a 5. Some people say these are the best versions of Yates and Wheeler, and hard to disagree. Competitiveness wise, I gave it a 2 instead of a 3 because it really depends on the standards you use. Uh, if we look at it as far as what the judges are looking for, and if you're going for a unique criteria, if you go by the aesthetic side, you could probably say Flex 1 easily, but if you go for the size and muscularity criteria, probably would say Yates 1 convincingly. So I wouldn't give it the maximum grade when it comes to competitiveness. Rivalry 1 is pretty self-explanatory. Predictability 2 because Flex Wheeler was a newcomer. Historical significance, I think this was, very significant. Best shapes, the birth, some people would say the birth of the Mass Monster era, and the lineup I thought it was great, so it gets a 2 for show quality. Now we get to Sean Ray placing second against Yates. So in this show, Lee not only did Yates tore his tricep, but also he came in a bit off, a bit bloated compared to last year, which gets the physique to go down to 3. Maybe 3 is a bit harsh because Sean Ray still looked exceptional, and to be fair, Yates also looked great, just not up to his standard set last year. Yet he gets a bump in competitiveness. It was a closer show with Yates' flaws. It made for an easier case for Sean Ray to win. Rivalry wise, gets a 2 because Sean Ray used to be more vocal about the politics and everything going on in the Mr. Olympia and the criteria in the judging. Predictability, I gave it a 1. It was the third consecutive year Yates won, so a trend was setting. Historical significance, I gave it a 2, and show quality, I gave it a 1. Next year, we got Kevin Levrone, much bigger now, but still placing second against Dorian Yates, who improved considerably from last year. Sorry, that's why physique-wise, it gets a 4. Competitiveness-wise, I give it a 2, even though Levrone improved considerably since 1992. So did Dorian. So I think if you go for mass and conditioning criteria, Dorian clearly wins. Rivalry, this was the second time these two were winner and runner up, so there was a rivalry uh, being built. Predictability again won. Dorian kept winning. Historical significance, this some people argue is Dorian's best shape, so it's pretty significant. Also one of the best of Levrone. 96, we have Sean Ray again being the runner-up. In the 90s, it was kind of a revolving door between Ray, Levrone, somebody, and Flex Wheeler for second place. Sean Ray made a strong case in this Olympia, kept looking great, but it was not enough. Competitiveness wise, Sean Ray matched up well against Dorian Yates, yet it was the size that prevented him from really winning or having a chance of being the number one at the Mr. Olympia rivalry. It was a pretty big rivalry. Sean Ray was pretty vocal about Dorian Yates showing up with the torn muscles and still winning. Predictability wise, it was pretty predictable again. This was Dorian's fifth win. We go to 1997, where it was a very controversial Mr. Olympia. Dorian Yates came in with basically no arms and bigger but also more bloated than ever before. Even though his back might have seen some improvements, overall his package was not up to the standards set in previous years. As we can see, much more bloated than in 92, 93. So this show gets a much lesser ranking than all the others before because of that. Physique, I gave it a 1 because honestly, I feel like it was unacceptable of Mr. Olympia having so many missing body parts winning the show. It was pretty competitive in the sense of it should have been close, and the challenger should have won, the runner up, Nasser Al Somebody. Dorian maybe shouldn't even have placed in second, much less first. Rivalry, there was, well, at this point, everyone was gunning for Dorian. Predictability, I give it a 1 because, it was Dorian's sixth Mr. Olympia. And I gave it a 0 as far as show quality because it was probably a bad decision, and it set a bad reputation of the IFBB when a bodybuilder shows up in Dorian Yates' condition and still wins the show. But next year we got a big improvement. Ronnie Coleman winning, Flex Wheeler placing in second. This show was much more improved. It was, besides Ronnie Coleman's gyno, it wasn't much of a controversy. Ronnie Coleman brought a great package with size and conditioning that Flex Wheeler just couldn't match. Physique wise, this gets a 4. Competitiveness gives it 2. I think Ronnie was a clear winner. It was totally unpredictable. Ronnie had placed like ninth last year's Mr. Olympia, while Flex was uh, predicted by many people to be the winner. This was extremely significant. Ronnie Coleman would go on to dominate bodybuilding, and this overall was just a great show. So it also gets a show quality of 2. Now, on to the next year, we get the same top 2, Ronnie Coleman and Flex Wheeler. Ronnie Coleman improving even more from last year. Maybe he wasn't as conditioned, but he had fixed the gyno and he was still in great condition and even bigger size now, as we can clearly see by these awesome pictures. So, so I dropped the competitiveness score, even though Flex Wheeler came in bigger than last year. If you go pose by pose, I don't think it's that close, and you could even agree that Chris Cormier could have been the second place. Rivalry, I put it at 3. You could tell that this meant a lot to Flex Wheeler, even though those two were big friends and are. Flex Wheeler was really determined to win the Mr. Olympia, and he wouldn't have it any other way. So his reaction at the end really shows that this was really personal. Predictability, Ronnie last year had set new standard and he kept up with it. To me, this is a very significant show also, which gets a 4 in significance and show quality too. The top 6 was great all the way through, and we had a lot of great debuts also on this show. So overall, great lineup. Now we get to the year 2000, and Ronnie Coleman keeps winning. This time against Kevin Levrone, being runner-up for the third time, I believe. So the lineup was pretty similar to years prior, especially the top 6, but the quality had diminished somewhat. Because of that, the physique score goes down. Competitiveness wise, I also don't think it was that competitive. Rivalry wise, uh, Kevin Levrone had also been vocal around this time about the scoring and the criteria and the aesthetics, so you could also tell that this wasn't just a contest. There was a lot of heated emotions going into it. Still, it was relatively predictable, the result. Now, on to the next year. This one surely wasn't predictable. Ronnie Coleman winning over Jay Cutler, who placed in second. Now, this show paired up with the prior year show was when the bubble gut was starting to become more apparent on the champion, Ronnie Coleman. Nevertheless, I feel like this was actually a big improvement over last year's Olympia when it comes to just the overall excitement. I think the physique, I gave it a 4. I bumped up the score because even though Ronnie Coleman wasn't at his best shape, he still had phenomenal features. And I think that Jay Cutler this year, he had some of his best shape and he was definitely a worthy adversary. Competitiveness wise, it was very competitive. Some people still say that Jay should have won. A rivalry, it still wasn't there. It would escalate until it became probably the biggest rivalry in bodybuilding. But at this time, Jay Cutler kind of came out of nowhere, somewhat. Predictability. Ronnie, yes, won, but I don't think people would have predicted Jay Cutler to be second place and for it to be as competitive. Now we go to 2002. So in this year, Jay Cutler didn't compete. He got upset with the IFBB and the Olympia organization. I believe that he probably was upset about the scorecards, but I think he was also disqualified and later on reinstated his placing. I think it was to do with diuretic usage. He failed the test. So he didn't compete in 2002, and it might have been the reason why it took him so long to win the Mr. Olympia because Ronnie Coleman came in considerably off, and that's why this show gets a 2 on the physique wise. Still, I don't think he was competitive, at least when it comes to the top two, which is Ronnie Coleman and Kevin Levrone. If anything, it should have been Ronnie Coleman and Gunther Schlierkamp. Rivalry, I feel like the sentiment of Ronnie Coleman getting away with the bubble gut and being, not aesthetic was at a pretty high level of re- relevance, excuse me. And Kevin Levrone was pretty vocal on the subject. Yeah, it was still a pretty predictable show. Ronnie Coleman won once again. Now we come to 2003. If you like bodybuilding, you definitely know this show. Ronnie Coleman did a total 180 and he shocked the world of bodybuilding, bringing in an unbelievable physique, unbelievable shape, as you can tell. And yeah, Jay Cutler was also on this show. It was the runner-up, but it was Ronnie Coleman's show, no doubt about it. Physique wise, Jay Cutler showed a very good physique, Maybe I think it's probably a bit overshadowed by Ronnie Coleman's. A lot of people don't mention Jay Cutler physique as one of his best, but it's still pretty good. But Ronnie Coleman, he set a new standard that I don't think anyone has matched ever since. So that's why this gets a 5 for physique. Competitiveness, I don't think he was competitive. Rivalry, after Jay Cutler's hiatus from the Mr. Olympia and him recapturing again the runner-up spot, I think this, gets high grade in the rivalry wise, and it was also pretty significant. Now we go to 2004. As again, the same two placings for first and second. Although this was a bit weird because we had the challenge round, so it wasn't like the traditional final call out or the sending the top two on stage and announcing the winner. So it was a bit different. Physique wise, I give it a 3. Ronnie Coleman, he still looked good, but he wasn't as conditioned, and Jay Cutler was chasing the size game, which also meant he wasn't as sharp as 2001. I still don't think he was that competitive, honestly. Predictability was pretty predictable. Ronnie won once again his seventh title. Significance wise, I gave it a 3 because of the challenge round. This was a new concept in the Mr. Olympia. Now we go to 2005 again, the same number 1 and number 2. And I think that Ronnie Coleman improved his physique. He came a bit downsized compared to other years, but better in conditioning and overall flow. And I think that, but still, I think that because he was a bit downsized, I think the gap between them definitely closed a bit. And obviously, Ronnie Coleman was also getting up there in years, so this show I think was a bit more competitive. Now we go to 2006, and finally, Jay Cutler wins. But I bumped down the physique score because really Jay Cutler was able to place highly enough for long enough for Ronnie Coleman's body to give out on him and to start deteriorate. So Jay, this version of Jay, it's a good Jay, but it isn't necessarily remarkable compared to his whole career. Again, it was Ronnie Coleman who, in a way, Father Time defeated Ronnie Coleman more so than Jay Cutler himself. So that explains most of the score, especially the predictability. It was bound to happen. Uh, you know, Eventually Jay would win. Ronnie Coleman would. It was in a slight decline since 2004. Now we get to 2007, Jay's first defense of the title, and it was pretty controversial. And we are probably looking at the worthy winner, the rightful winner, which unfortunately didn't take place. Jay Cutler retained the title in highly controversial matter. Physique wise, I gave it a 3 because I think that both guys were although in good shape. Jay was off in a way, but it didn't have necessarily any missing body parts or any issue that maybe Ronnie had last year. Was just off conditioning wise, and Victor Martinez brought his best package to date and probably ever of his career. Again, competitiveness, he was very competitive, it was very close. Most people argue should have been the other way around. Dexter Jackson versus Jay Cutler in 2008. So Jay Cutler basically he repeated his shape to a certain extent from last year and he paid for it. Dexter Jackson, much more conditioned, was able to take first place. Victor Martinez didn't compete at this show, so the throne was there for the taking. I think again, both guys they were muscular wise, they were in very good condition. The problem was the leanness, of Jay Cutler. Rivalry wise, I gave it a 1 because Dexter Jackson was usually on the outside looking in. There wasn't necessarily any personal aspects of this win. It was very unpredictable. It seemed like we are going on the Jay Cutler era, whether it was in great conditioning or not, but this broke the trend for sure. Now we have 2009, and no, I didn't mistake on choosing this image. Branch Warren was definitely a surprise placing in the top two. And if you didn't know much about this show and knew about how good of a shape Dexter Jackson showed up and the fact that Jay Cutler reclaimed the crown, you would have said that this was the top two, but it was not. It was Jay Cutler and Branch Warren. To me, this show was great. To me, the physiques shown were top notch. I'm personally not a big fan of Branch Warren, but I can admit that he had great legs, great features, and great conditioning. And Jay Cutler showed up in arguably his best shape to the point where, if you think about it, it probably wasn't that competitive of a show, but it was definitely unpredictable going into it. Jay had been dethroned, and we had a lot of great competitors, great contenders to the throne of Mr. Olympia. I bumped up the show in significance and quality because I think it was definitely a stellar lineup. Now we go to 2010, where Phil Eve goes runner up for the first time, challenging Jay Cutler, his mentor. Jay still carrying the momentum from last year. I thought physique wise, both guys look great. They have had better shapes, but I thought these were pretty good. This was pretty competitive. Already in 2010, you could have made an argument for Phil winning, especially from the back. There was a certain rivalry, a certain sentiment of, master and protege, of almost feeling like eventually there will be a passing of the torch. And it was definitely a pretty significant show. It was Jay Cutler's last IFBB win, or one of the last. It was his last IFBB win of the Olympia. He probably won some shows after the Olympia, as they usually do, like a post Olympia tour. And 2011, Phil Eve now captures the title from Jay Cutler. We got the same top two, but the result was switched. This was, you know, very significant. I kept the physique score the same because even though I think Jay had a torn bicep, but I think Phil definitely improved. It was less bloated. It was more tight, more conditioned, but didn't lose any size besides in the mid session. So I thought it was still a great showing. It was obviously competitive, but not as much. I think Phil was now a clear winner, and it was very significant because it was the start of Philly's long reign. And his first defense of the reign came against his eventual arch nemesis, Kai Green. Kai Green, who had placed third at the 2011 Mr. Olympia, now bumped up to second. And physique wise, many people say this was their best battle. It was either this or the 2010 uh, Arnold Classic. Competitiveness wise, I think some people would have given this a 3 or a 3. I hear some people saying Kai should have won. Personally, I think Phil still was the clear winner when you really add up everything. But if you go post by post, I guess you could have an argument for Kai Green. To me, this was very significant. Obviously, it was the beginning, or the escalation of the one of the biggest rivalries in bodybuilding. Then on the next year, we had a continuation. Kai Green placing second to Phil Heath again. Yet this time, I would say it wasn't as competitive at all. Phil Heath brought maybe his best package, while Kai Green wasn't as sharp as last year. It was bigger, but definitely not as sharp. So that justifies the competitiveness and the predictability score on this show. Now, next year, Philly definitely regressed. His midsection became much bloated and he wasn't as sharp as the year prior. Still, he won. He won the show. It's very controversial. A lot of people say Kai Green should have won, but to be fair, Kai Green also had some problems of his own, especially also the bloating. Both guys had significant bloating. Then next year, Kai Green basically boycotts the Olympia, and Phil corrects his big mistake from the year prior, coming in with a much trimmed midsection, much more in control at the very least. And he gets a relatively straightforward win over Dexter Jackson. Not much to say on their score. I think it's pretty self explanatory. The year after, it was Sean Roden placing in second place, but the show was somewhat similar. Phil still won pretty convincingly, bringing probably his driest shape conditioning wise. Now, in 2017, we had some shakeup on the top three with William Bonac and Big Ramy, and Big Ramy placing runner up. This brought a lot of excitement to the show. Philip was his bloatedness had returned, which was a bad sign, but everything else was top notch. This is one of his best shapes if you disregard the gut. It was more competitive, definitely much more competitive than the year prior. A lot of people claiming Big Ramy should have won this show. And then finally, and I got a typo there, it's not Big Ramy, it's Sean Roden who won the Mr. Olympia contest. Finally over Phil Heath. Sean Roden brought an incredible package with the deeply cut midsection and great conditioning, while Phil Heath could not correct his bloated stomach, and he definitely seemed out of breath and out of, in bad conditioning, at least when it comes to cardiovascular conditioning and withstanding all of the posing on stage. So Sean Roden took this show. It was very significant. It was, to a certain extent, it was a sign by the IFBB that bubble guts should not be tolerated, and that the aesthetic era would have been in return, if not full force, at least it gained a bit more significance being aesthetic on stage. Now, the year prior, a lot had happened in bodybuilding, and this lineup was definitely a victim of all of those things that happened. It was relatively underwhelming, Mr. Olympia. I don't think it was as bad as people say. I really think that the biggest downgrade of the show was the lineup, not necessarily the shape that the competitors brought. That's why the historical significance is just a one. Brandon Curry won this show over William Bonac. But in 2020, we got a much more exciting Mr. Olympia. Philip returned. Big Ramy also returned to Olympia stage, and this was very, very unpredictable. Big Ramy, who wasn't qualified for the Mr. Olympia, he got a special invite. He wins the show, bringing one of his best packages ever, and this was definitely a very unpredictable and significant show. There was also the last show of Dexter Jackson. This might have been the last show of Phil Leaf also, and it was the crowning moment of Big Ramy. And it kept up the momentum on to the next year. The same top two, Big Ramy and Brandon Curry. This show, it suffered a bit from being very predictable, and the guy's not necessarily improving much over last year's physique. Now on to the rankings. So here's from the top 32 to the top 15. Now there's a lot of shows tied because the scores aren't that different. We definitely got on the lower end of the rankings the shows that either were the most predictable or the ones where the shapes were the most underwhelming. I think that these scores do make sense to a certain extent. Maybe you would disagree with some of the placings, but I think overall, if you look at it on uh, an overall way, you would say that these placings do make sense and they do reflect the quality of the top two, and to a broader extent the whole show. And now the top 10, and Obviously, the my typo is still there in fourth place or tied for second place. Big Ram, it's not Big Ram, it's Sean Road, no defeated Phil Eve in 2018. But the winner, as you can see, at least by this ranking method, is Lee Haney and Dorian Yates battling it out in 1991. So this got the top placing by just 1 point. Then it was followed by Dorian Yates and Flex Wheeler in 1993. Great lineup. Ronnie Coleman and Flex Wheeler in 1998. This one over the 99 show because it was more unpredictable. Still, the 99 show plays well, tied for fifth, and the changing of the standards by Sean Roden defeating Phil Eve is tied for second with 16 points. So I know this was a pretty clumsy, pretty long-winded video, but it was my first attempt, and I definitely hope you enjoyed, and you know share your feedback in the comment section. Thank you very much.